Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We will get started in about 30 seconds or so. Just give people time to log in and into the Zoom link.
So we have 6 people now as attendees,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. So shall we? Let's get going and let's
Yeah,
get this
absolutely. Yeah.
rolling. Um, my name is Sanjay Kucheria, and welcome everyone to who's joining us today, the 5th of January, 2026. On behalf of the Sanatan Dharma Group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session. Our effort through these conversations is to engage deeply with Indian civilizational ideas as living frameworks that shape society, ethics, and collective consciousness. Before we begin, a quick note on housekeeping. This session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A segment toward the end of the talk, and audience questions can be submitted using the questions feature at the bottom of your Zoom app. The idea of caste is often discussed today as a social hierarchy, frequently stripped of historical nuance and civilizational context. Much of this understanding has been shaped by colonial categories and modern political narratives, and these interpretations continue to influence contemporary academic policy and now even corporate debates, including recent discussions around the new University Grants Commission or UGC regulations. Today's session, Dissolving Caste Consciousness, invites us to step back and re examine these assumptions, drawing from the Vedantic vision of the Upanishads. We will explore the original meanings of concepts such as varna and jati and how they evolved over time, and how a deeper understanding can help us reflect on identity and help us navigate leadership and societal challenges more thoughtfully. It is an honor to have with us Pandit Satish Sharma, a scholar, a Pandit of Dharmic traditions, and interfaith speaker. Satish has spoken at many gatherings, including schools, universities, temples, churches, and general gatherings where seekers of truth, wisdom, reality, and harmony congregate. Having been a mathematician, an auditor, an accountant, and held multiple directorships with international experience of over 25 years, a time came when satisfaction with professional achievement and the badges of social success no longer satisfied Panditji. In fact, Panditji was recently awarded the title of Dharma Samarakshak, or custodian of Dharma, and authorized to speak on the 6 darshans of Indian philosophy by the Council of Hindu Saints and Swamis in Rishikesh, a TEDx speaker and guest speaker at philosophy and yoga events at British colleges and universities, and keynote speaker on dharmic issues at parliamentary debates and events. He represents the Hindu community at national events such as Remembrance Day and has made numerous appearances presenting the dharmic view on the BBC and other channels. Welcome, Panditji, over to you. And may I ask that you take us through your presentation and share your
Sanjay.
reflections with us?
Pranam ji and Jai
Uh,
Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.
Uh, the first action I have to do is to hack that introduction because I think it takes far too long, and I hadn't realized that you'd been sent such a long introduction. But my apologies for inflicting that upon everybody. It wasn't intentional. Firstly, if I have your permission, I'd just like to invoke the Sehanavavatu mantra that we use to create a container within which very contentious and often passionate emotional subjects can be discussed. And so that mantra is often used in conversations, but also in yoga classes, and perhaps people have already encountered it. So it's Om Sehanavavatu, Sehano Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karavavahe, तेजस्विना वधीतम अस्तु मा विद्विषावहे ओम शांति शांति ओम. And the essence of it is to remind everybody that when we talk about something like this, let's do it in a manner which is affectionate, where we trust each other, where the ultimate goal is not victory or defeat over each other, but the benefit of society. And may we never have harsh words between us. So it's a great container for this particular subject of caste. By introduction, I had never envisaged that I would be speaking or even researching or even exploring this particular issue until 2013. Here in the United Kingdom, we have a very established Sanatani family, and we do not have discrimination on the basis of caste. And yet in 2013, an allegation was made in the House of Lords that half of the Hindu community in the United Kingdom were discriminating against the other half on the basis of caste in the public sphere. And so that means in the area of employment, it means in the area of legislation, all of those areas which are outside of personal engagement. And this allegation was made in the House of Lords. It was made by a very senior member of the Church of England, a bishop. And I used to follow these things. It struck me that this was not my lived experience in this country. And so I started to do a bit of research. But one thing that became crystal clear to me was that if this caste consciousness was embedded and seeded in the Hindu community here in the United Kingdom, it would be a stimulus, it would be an instigator of suspicion and conflict within our community. And I could see that the seeding of it into the younger generation would create conflict. It was a creation of an identity trope in the minds of Hindus, and it wasn't based on fact, it wasn't based on evidence. And so that's what really brought me into this space. I could see the situation where a framework, a chakravyuha, was being created, and that it was going to create in our minds an understanding of who we were, which was at odds with who we actually were. And that's what really plunged me into this space, realizing the harm it could do. It really spurred me on to understand why this was being done, who it was being done by, and how it was at odds with our Sanatani Adhyatmic literature, our Shastra, and the teachings of Yoga Bhyas and our Darshanas. The outcome of it all was, shall we say, a deep dive into history. Where did the words come from? What was their etymology? Who wielded them? And what was the impact on the individual, but also on the kinship groups within Bharat of this particular, shall we say, this particular branding exercise? So it plunged me into this, and that was in 2013, 2016. We managed to defeat the government and the establishment, and especially the Church of England's attempts to badger us into accepting that this is who we were. So we defeated it. But it was a very interesting experience because it gave me a very practical and first-hand realization of how this process could be conducted, starting with a Greenfields community who are very dharmic and yet completely without caste consciousness. This mischievous interloper entered into our space, and the outcome would have been to create suspicion and conflict. And so it gave me an understanding that this possibly could also have been done in Bharat, because that would be a more natural expression and an understanding of exactly how this arose there. In order to challenge somebody like the Church of England, an institution, the House of Lords, and the parliamentary legislative bodies, I had to find evidence, I had to find records, documentary evidence, first-hand sources, primary sources, and so on, to be able to rebut the allegations that Hindus, by nature, supported by their scriptures, were supporters of a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous social structure. That was the allegation that was being directed at us, and we managed to do it successfully. Having done it successfully, it brought me into an understanding of the incredibly challenging conversations which need to be had in Bharat. Bharat has bought into, the Bharatiya community, the polity, the judiciary have bought into what ultimately I discovered was a trope, a hate trope. And the consequences of that, ever since this was implemented in Bharat, are with us even today. We have in Bharat, right now, at this moment in time, the way I see it, my vision is we have two children who have been born, and one of them has been born into a kinship group, which the caste system says is general caste. Another child has been born into a kinship group, which the conventional conversation would say is OBC, SC/ST, Dalit, etc., i.e., non-general caste. And from that moment forward, these children are going to be put onto life paths which will pit them against each other. In order for one to advance and derive benefit, they have to subscribe to this particular understanding of who they are and what their society is. My vision is that both of those children will be born with incredible potential, with incredible opportunities for contributing to society. There will be astrophysicists there, there will be AI creators there. There are potentially children being born with unbelievable ability to contribute towards the Bharat's movement into the 21st and 22nd centuries. And yet, they will have been shoehorned into a conflict situation. We need to find out, how do we reach those children, work out what their abilities are, give them the opportunities for those abilities to be fully manifest and realized, and to make those abilities available to the wider Samaj. This is the challenge that's in front of us. From where we are, that's how I see a successful conclusion to this whole situation. And that's where I'd like to take everybody towards. In my mind, I have a sankalpa that by 2027, the end of 2027, we will have taken the heat and the anger out of this particular issue, and to some degree created a mechanism or a pathway whereby children and indeed adults from all the communities can have this conversation and to work out how to heal this, what is ultimately, in my mind, a family feud created by a third party interloper. And so that's the reason why I'm here. That's the conversation that I'm going to be presenting. And now I'm going to take you into a slide show. And the slideshow is something I produced a few years ago to explain this scenario and my findings to a group of students. And so I'm going to take everybody through it now. Before I jump in, if I can just do one quick shout out, I'm going to be jumping across a number of relatively deep ideas. And so with the time that we have available, I don't want to spend too much time going into any particular rabbit hole. But the book, I produce a little book. It's very cheap. It's very easily available. It's on Kindle and everywhere else. I would recommend it as a source of an alternative history of this issue for anybody to have a look at. And that's what it's called. Thank you very much, Sanjay, for allowing me to do that. So I'll turn now to my presentation. And the idea that I wanted to put forward is that we should review this from a clean sheet. For the time being, let's just assume that this notion of caste is something which is it's an antipodean opposite to what Shastra say. Our Shastra repeatedly say in the Gita, in the Upanishads, that we are Atma and that the body doesn't define us. Adi Shankaracharya ji in his Nirvan Shatkam puts it so beautifully that all of the temporary things, our identity, our thinking, our feeling, our social labels, none of them are the reality of who we are. The reality of who we are is actually Shivoham Shivoham is the phrase that he uses. And so that's the backdrop to what I'm going to be speaking about. From that point of view, I'd like to put forward an idea that the understanding of caste is itself an ism. And I'd like to extend that a little bit to the notion that its source is not indigenous and that it has emerged from a very dark period of history when Bharat was being targeted and subjected to unbelievably difficult circumstances. The people who were in Bharat at the time of British colonialism were also in America, where they eradicated over 100 million indigenous peoples, and they were doing similar things in Africa. And so we emerged from that period with a set of ideas which I think are the equivalent of being mentally colonized. So our objective is to provide a little bit of clarity about this thing called caste. Words have meanings, and if we understand the meanings and we all share the same understanding, we can have a conversation about it. I also want to touch on the reality of when and how these words, caste, Dalit, and discrimination, appeared in Bharat. I want to reinstall a dharmic lens based on our Shastra with which we can scrutinize this issue. And also, it's worth in passing to identify those who benefit from nourishing and sustaining caste discrimination as an industry, because there are those who benefit significantly on ensuring that this doesn't get dissolved. Finally, we can have a reflection on solutions to remove what I've called a mimetic virus of caste consciousness. In my mind, success in this venture will have been achieved when people do not identify themselves in accordance with this chakra view, which I call caste consciousness. So just as questions to carry with you as we go into here, just reflect on what your own opinions are about interfaith, what your thoughts are about conversion, this notion that Hinduism is a religion which can be plugged into interfaith models, and we have the equivalences of other religions as well. And at the heart of it all, the notion, do all religions lead to God? These thoughts are actually foundational to those persons who created the caste concept and proliferated it. And who were they? They were, we're told, former white supremacists. I would draw your attention to the remark made by Winston Churchill, where he said that he had absolutely no problem in accepting the validity of a more superior race removing a more inferior race and replacing them. So he was, without doubt, and in his own words, a white supremacist. We're told that that is a former position, and the white Euro-Christian world doesn't adhere to senses of its supremacy. Let's accept that at face value for the moment. The people who were accusers, they were also colonialists. Not only did they feel that they had a sense of supremacy about who they were, they also felt they had the authority to go and colonize the world, to seize resources, to civilize everybody else, to recreate them in their own vision, in their own image. And there's no doubt that Christianity, it was a fundamental part of this mindset, that the civilizing mission was to actually elevate the dark continents of Bharat and Africa and bring them into a more superior Christian fold. Caste, understand exactly what it is. The caste concept defined in law in the United Kingdom, as elsewhere, is defined as being a social structure where there are hereditary stratification identifiers. There is a hierarchy where a person belonging to a particular strata is deemed to be more superior, more powerful, more influential. And the third aspect is endogamous. Now, these are the three defining aspects of a caste system: hereditary, hierarchical, and endogamous. These are not in Hindu scripture. Hindu scripture does not have anywhere a word or a concept which captures these three elements of a society. So, caste as a concept is not something which finds support in Hindu Shastra. And we'll come through to the actual Varnas in a few moments. Varnas, I will assert, are non-hereditary. So let me just clarify this. A child born into a family where the father is of a particular varna does not need, and in fact, the Shastra assert that there is no guarantee, there is no requirement for that child to be of the same varna. Varnas are aptitudinal. Varna is an idea which says that when a child or a person incarnates, at the moment of their incarnation, they are subjected to influences which are cosmological, planetary. The grahas, the planets, influence the body at that moment in time, and that body acquires a certain combination of gunas, sattva, tamas, and rajas. And each and every person has a different element, a different makeup, a different template of those gunas. And so it's absolutely impossible to assert that Brahmin families give birth to Brahmin children. So this Varna idea, this concept, accept it or don't accept it. is non-hereditary and it's non-hierarchical. There is no sense of a hierarchy in this. And endogamy is something that we'll look at separately. But these are the ideas which are from Hindu scripture. I mentioned, and I'll just skimp over this, Professor Oak put forward an idea that we have a civilization which spans a long period of time. And in that period of time, we managed to sustain a civilization and a society. And the concept of caste is actually destructive of sustainability of societies. Varna is actually supportive of sustainability of society. And so we'll come back to this as well. The period of darkness, we've had 1400 years of incredible darkness. And at the beginning of that period, we went in with one sort of a society. And at the end of that period, we've emerged with a completely different society molded by adharmic, non-indigenous social ideologies. Who are these people who helped mold it? These are just some clips from the time so that you get an idea. You'll see these are publications in Britain which were being published at the time of occupation of Bharat. You'll see the notion being put forward that justice is a white woman carrying a sword and a shield, and she is beating and using a sword against dark people to get them into the light. On the right-hand side is another image that was put out, and that was in 1858. And you can see India is being depicted as the supplicant appealing to the more advanced civilized sovereign for help in their upliftment. At the same time as this dark period in America, the same people had a mission, and they called, I remember there was a slogan, "Kill the Indian to save the man." This was the erasure of an indigenous ideology and its replacement by a different ideology, which had as its supreme manifestation the white European Christian. And the intention with this phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," was to create a mechanism for teaching barbaric non-white people what they should really become. And it was pursued with incredible vigor and determination. Where did this concept come into Bharat? So I'll expand on where the source of this is. But Bishop Heber in 1840, he made a statement that amongst the pagans, there is no obstacle so formidable to the reception of Christianity as caste. So he is identifying that there is something called caste in Bharat, and it is resistant to conversion. Just by way of background, up until 1813, the British East India Company had refused to allow clerics to go to Bharat at all. They were worried that these clerics will go there, will disrupt and disturb the society, and cause an obstacle for the continuation of the East India Company's processes of resource extraction. And so they banned clerics all the way up until 1813. And then from 1813 to 1844, Christian missionary organizations were trying their best to convert the people, but they discovered that there was something that they determined as caste. Now he goes on to elaborate on what he means when he says caste, and what he actually is talking about is the indigenous jati varna kinship groups. Later on in his writings, he also wrote, "We think, however, that this wonderful institution of India." Now, he is again referring to Jati Varna kinship groups. And what he has suggested is that it's a wonderful institution, and the manner in which it worked ensured that individuals were fulfilled and the contribution of these individuals to society was maximized. And in the book, there is an expansion on that. So here is a paper that I found. I'm a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society in London. There were a bunch of historians who were traipsing around Bharat from 1823 onwards, and they gathered an awful lot of documents, and they have a huge store of records about what was being done by European Christians in Bharat at that time. And this is something I stumbled upon. In 1844, on the 4th of January, a conference was called of the missionary organization so that they could scratch their heads and decide on how to break out of this conundrum. They were not being able to convert people. And so the records of it clearly established in my mind that there was an intention. It was a malicious intention on how do we break apart jati varna groups so that we can then infiltrate and penetrate these social structures, these kinship groups, and start to, shall we say, replace ancestral identities with the converted identities that we are wanting to have in this country. And as I say, the records are here and they're reproduced in my book. One of the other things I discovered in 1911, there was an officer of the British East India Company who was conducting censuses and trying to record the structures and problems at that time. And in his work, he noted, we pigeonholed everyone by caste. And if we couldn't find a true caste for them, labeled them with the name of the hereditary occupation. Most importantly, he then says, we deplore the caste system and its effect on social and economic problems, but we are largely responsible for the system we deplore. So this is a European Christian officer of the East India Company accepting a number of factors which I think are interesting and need to be considered when we automatically assume that caste is something that was indigenous and a fundamental part of our religious and social traditions. He went on also to note that prior to the British involving themselves in reorganizing the Bharatiya structures and society, he notes that the original structures were really very fluid under indigenous rule. There are other remarks that he made which support the contention that I'm putting forward, but he has said, I have intended pointing out that there is a very wide revolt against the classification of occupational castes, that these castes have been largely manufactured and almost entirely preserved as separate castes by the British government. So the notion that is being presented here, and which he was obviously very troubled by, is that a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous caste structure was largely the creation of colonizers, and it was implemented, it was enforced, it was manufactured, and it was preserved by the British occupying forces in Bharat. Dr. Ambedkar, he also studied the Varna idea, and it was explained to him by Swami Dayanandji, and he records in his work Annihilation of Castes, I must admit that the Vedic theory of Varna is sensible and an inoffensive thing. So this is the definition of Varna in our Shastra that he is referring to, and that was explicated to him by Swami Dayanandji. And he goes on to say, it did not admit birth as a determining factor in fixing in place of an individual in society. It only recognized worth. And this is a very important observation that was made. So turning back to the people who were, shall we say, in positions of physical power, they had the capacity to wield force legally. They had a civilization which was famous for divide and rule. And a fundamental part of divide and rule is the capacity to create an in-group and an out-group, and then instill hatred in one for the other, or in both for each other. And hatred has a number of dimensions. One is, as I say, the in-group and the out-group, but also hatred is something which can be seeded. It is incremental, it's subliminal, it's persistent, and it is repetitive. It recreates itself generation after generation. And if there's a political establishment which is keen to take advantage of conflict between groups, then they love to nurture it and water it. And this is something that I think we need to take further forward when we deal with this particular issue. In Bharat, we have this notion of samskara. And samskara, once you understand what they are, they're the roots of our identity. They're the value system that we use to make instinctive decisions on. And samskara are normally, between the age of 3 to 7, accepted as truths, and they're accepted without scrutiny by children. And if you have a look at what has been happening across the globe ever since the colonization mission started, clerics love to run schools because it gives access to them to innocent minds which are forming at a time when some samskaras can be seeded, and some samskaras can be positive and they can be negative. Identity replacement is therefore what I call mental colonization. This is a question which everybody should now ask themselves. And, are we colonized? And what tools would you actually use to self-scrutinize yourself, to understand whether you have been mentally colonized or not? And how do you know? In the book, I've made a beginning of this process, but this is something that I'm doing a lot more work on to help a person understand what their samskaras are. Where do they come from? What are dharmic and what are adharmic? And then hopefully a journey can be continued with individually where you arrive at a particular point, and when you get to that point, you will have a clear understanding of whether you're colonized or not. An interesting segue at the moment is to consider Goebbels' rules of propaganda when you look at the way in which the caste trope was seeded. And in the book, there is an analysis of this. And on the internet, you'll be able to find the 5 rules of propaganda. And you'd be shocked and hopefully not too surprised by the end of the conversation that we're having, that the process of seeding hatred, especially the process of seeding caste into a community, follows the 5 basic rules of propaganda as delineated by Goebbels. This is again from the book, but basically it's the manner in which divide and rule was knowingly implemented. And in the book, there are records from the House of Lords, from the British Parliament, where they openly assert, and without any sense of regret or shame, that they are intending to use the strategies of divide and rule in India because it works for them. One area that I did some study on is how do we understand these samskaras and take ownership of what's being told to us. And these little slides I'm showing you now, these are slides taken from religious education teaching here in the United Kingdom, and they are appalling. So this is religious education teaching of what Hinduism is. And so rather than looking at Vedanta or the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Upanishads, or anything else, they devote an inordinate amount of time, and they do this in the United States also, on this system of caste. And it is actually reinforcing the ideas which were created by those people who sought to deconstruct Bharatiya society. These I'll make available, but you can see the imagery. The the concern that I had was that when you have children who are being taught in a class setting at an age when their personality is not fully formed, they're very vulnerable. And if you can make them feel embarrassed and ashamed of some part of their identity group, and it's an assertion as to what their identity group is, then that child automatically moves away from something which is embarrassing and humiliating. And when I looked at the notes that are being used to teach what they call Hinduism, it became crystal clear that a motive, which you can see from the records of what they used to teach, a motive was clearly to alienate Hindu children from their own ancestral kinship groups. The same process I found had actually been used very, very extensively by the Roman Catholic Church in its dealings in Rwanda, and the genocide that happened in Rwanda is a microcosmic journey of exactly what happened in Bharat in terms of its journey from being integrated, horizontally valued kinship groups, what we call jatis and varna jatis, into a hierarchy. This is exactly what they did in Rwanda, and it's worth a further bit of exploration. So at the end of the book, I've managed to support a number of identifiers. One is that caste, as defined in law in Bharat, was a creation of British colonialists. The Dalit or untouchables, where did they come from? If my assertion is that the Varna Jati system, over a long period of time spanning millennia, could not create this environment, where did they come from? And the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, I would point everybody to have a look at it because that was the mechanism that was used to create an underclass in Bharat, which served the British desire to separate and create divide and rule, but it also gave them an incredible amount of taxation and excuses for possessing assets. The 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, it's worth exploring further. One last thing that the book manages to establish, and I want to assert this as something each of us needs to reflect upon, is that this libelous trope, it actually creates a framework which denies the Hindu the right to be viewed innocent until proven guilty. It uses that classic divide and rule structure of creating an oppressor and an oppressed trope, and then seeding it into society's consciousness, and then enshrining it into law. And once that's done, the persons who are deemed to be oppressors are automatically denied the human right of being viewed as innocent until proven guilty. And so when I referred at the beginning to two children being born at the same time in different kinship groups, this is actually fundamental to one of those children, because one child will grow up thinking that their ancestors were oppressors, and the other will grow up thinking that their ancestors were oppressed. Without evidence, this is some skada that are going to be seeded, and so one group loses the right at birth to be viewed innocent until proven guilty. It's a fundamental um, travesty of what law is. The objective of the book is to accelerate the removal of this mimetic virus. You know, the concept of caste has to be extracted from the dharmic mindset. And in our Shastra, you know, we are taught that if you have a thorn in your body and it's causing you pain, you can use a thorn to take the first thorn out. And avidya is something which is dissipated and deconstructed by the presence of vidya. And so I'm hoping that the more and more of us who get to understand what the reality of it was, the less vulnerable we will be, the less likely we will be to fall into a chakravyuha of somebody else's creation. You know, we have to educate our dharmic diaspora that there is a caste-free dharmic history, scripture, and spirituality. And that is actually our true inheritance. And that really is what we should be connecting our next generation with. And I have a vision to unite dharmic communities in a future which is entirely free of caste. An India free of the concept of caste, you know, what would that actually look like? What would it be? I've tried to envision this, and I must admit, every time I envision it, it gives me a great deal of confidence. And a vision of those two children actually coming together as friends without this baggage and being able to work together and relate together to maximize and support each other's journey towards fulfillment, as well as maximizing the contribution that they make to our samaj. That's a vision. That's my aspiration that one day we will see that. So before I conclude and we move into the Q&A and conversation, you know, there are these things called unscrutinized truths. We assume them to be true because we imbibe them at a very young age. You know, there was a time when everybody had as an accepted truth that the earth is flat. And this was unchallenged. It sort of subsisted for a long period of time, and people who challenged it were actually vilified and denigrated and diminished. The earth is not flat. It's one of these truths which has been turned over. And another unscrutinized truth, this assertion that if you're an Indian, you're born into a caste. It is such a pernicious and invalid assertion. And so this I'm also hoping that the book will help people to get to a point in understanding is that to be an Indian is not to belong to a caste. The moment you actually acknowledge that, in fact, to be an Indian means you're automatically allocated to a caste, you've already fallen into a framework which was created by people who did not have the best interests of the Bharatiya civilization at heart. The book has actually been shared extensively with our Sanatani family members, but also with members of the Christian family. And one of the most wonderful, reassuring reactions I've seen is that the majority of Christians are unaware that in their ancestral kinship group, these acts were inflicted and perpetrated upon our own indigenous civilization. And those who have studied it and have read it and then gone away to research it have come back and said how grateful they were to be a part now of our coming together as human beings in the 21st century, looking for everybody's benefit. So that was a race through this particular subject. I've wanted to drop a few um, verbal hand grenades into everyone's consciousness, and hopefully there won't be too much heat and light, but there will be, well, heat and there will be light. The book is called Caste Conversion, a thoroughly colonial conspiracy. Thank you for the opportunity of speaking to you. When Sanjay mentioned the details about the group, I had a feeling that there might be a group of people here who are actually very competent, keen, and able to participate in the reversal of the harm done by this trope. There are very many people who, shall we say, by whatever circumstances, are unable to do that. But I'm always on the lookout for a group of people who have got the wherewithal to explore this and who can be taken, hopefully gently, to an understanding that this is vitally important. There is no point in becoming the third largest GDP when internally your community is being set at each other's throats. And in a very short space of time, we know how decivilization, we just have to look across the road at Bangladesh. We know how decivilization and balkanization can actually be implemented. So thank you very much for that, Sanjay. Back to you.
Thank you, Panditji. That was very illuminating. I knew maybe 5% of this before you started. I'm probably about 57% now, and hopefully it improves beyond this. So let me first.
I can go home. If 57% has been achieved, then I should stop whilst I'm ahead. So no,
So
thank you
we,
for acknowledging that.
thank you, Panditji. Let me first start with a cover question that came up earlier on in the presentation. And I think you have, I would imagine, I would guess that you have addressed it in various ways through your presentation, but I'll pose it anyway and I'll read it out to you. The question is, why is the topic of this webinar dissolving caste consciousness? I think it's a great question because it should prompt the topic, the title of the presentation should prompt that question. Caste is
Excellent.
just caste is just a definition of the job one does, and nothing to do with the interpretation of colonial power who used it only to divide the society that so that they could rule. Can we dissolve the present day definition of teacher, ruler, businessman, worker, uh, which are the four stratifications you could call them? Can we just not dissolve them? Uh, and why?
Great question. Great question. Would you like me to respond to this, or are you going to give me one or two questions and I can incorporate them? Whatever you feel is most appropriate.
Go ahead and respond to this. I've got others.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a foundational. When I sat back and reflected upon what does an outcome, a successful conclusion look like? And there are all sorts of social justice type of conclusions, but I was looking at it from the point of view of a Sanatani, of a person who is steeped in the darshanas and in the dharmic worldview. Remember, we have a totally different dharmic lens to the lens which your Christians have. And so I was approaching it from that perspective, and I realized that the the key to this was twofold. One is that caste was actually a brand. The whole concept of caste was created like an economic brand. And what a brand does is it stimulates a person to respond in a particular way without scrutinizing how they respond. So if you look at it in marketing terms, billions are spent on getting a person to react to a brand in a predictable manner. For example, if I were to say to you, just do it, that's a phrase which has been seeded so that when we see a particular image, we are prompted we have loaded into our awareness a set of ideas, and we're prompted to act on that set of ideas without scrutinizing them. This is what branding is all about. And branding is seeded into a person's intellect and consciousness. And so when I began to understand that this was actually a brand, and it was a hate brand that was created and then seeded into our family so that we would fight each other without reflecting upon it, it became clear to me that the solution I was looking for was actually to reverse the process of branding, of seeding this idea into our consciousness. And so dissolving caste consciousness actually means to remove from our thinking and our value system the idea that a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous social structure actually existed in reality, and that that structure had four job-related strata, and they were hierarchically Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. That is a caste consciousness. That is the brand. And the most troubling aspect of it is the hereditary aspect, because the hereditary aspect is actually what causes conflict across generations and across strata. And so we have to dissolve that in our own consciousness. And the way we do that is by denying those who created it the opportunity to talk to us in the terms and the framework of this consciousness, this particular trope, and also in taking it out of our own thinking. Now, we need to make that move. The first step is the abandonment of a hierarchy, right? The sources in our Shastra which refer to this do not. In fact, there is an Upanishad, the Vajra Suchi Upanishad, which Vajra means uh,
Weapon.
diamond or a thunderbolt and so on. And Suchi is a needle. So it's like an incredibly powerful, diamond hard Upanishad. The ideas in it are supposed to be so penetrating. And it reiterates time and time again exactly what it is to be a Brahmin, for example, to be a Kshatriya, and so on. And they are not hierarchical and they are not a vertical strata. They're horizontal. Our tradition said that a varna is an aptitude, and all four varnas, they're like legs of a table. For any society to be able to sustain itself, it needs those four varnas to be optimized. We want the best Brahmins, we want the best Kshatriyas who are implementing justice, we want the best merchants, and we want the best work people, the skilled people, the artisans, and everybody else. All of them have to function together, and none of them functions in the state of a hierarchy. So if we can get rid of the notion of a hierarchy, we're moving from caste back to a varna jati system.
Thank you. Thank you, Panditji. So, related to that, where did this whole concept of Dalits come in from?
As I said, words have meanings,
Right.
right? And the word Dalit does not appear in any of our scriptures at all. It was created by persons during the colonial time and immediately after the colonial time who had inherited caste consciousness. They had bought into this particular idea. They didn't know that in the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act, the British government, if I use it as an example, in Madras, with a piece of legislation sculpted in London. That's where this legislation was sculpted. And it said that there are certain tribes who were born criminal, their ancestors were criminal. They are going to be criminal in this age, and they will forever be criminals. And if we can identify them, then all of a sudden we can seize their assets and we can confine their activities. And they use this piece of legislation to delegitimize any particular kinship group which they had designs on. For example, there were people who used to take goods from the east of India right the way across from the manufacturers into the markets, and they were deeply trusted. And they were noble people. They understood the amount of trust that was enshrined in them. Can you imagine taking valuable goods and then bringing payments from market back to the manufacturers? These were immediately designated when this act came in as criminal tribes because the British wanted to impose tax on the movement of goods. And they wanted to delegitimize a very noble and dignified kinship group. And so 273, I remember one record which said 273 of these tribes with the tick of a legislator's pen in Madras were designated as criminal tribes. Now, that wasn't all they did. When you were designated as a criminal tribe, you were actually confined. One, you were denied opportunities for advancement, you were denied education, you were denied the opportunity to engage in occupations, and you were confined to what were practically speaking concentration camps on the edges of towns and villages. And more often than not, the what were formerly noble groups with a great deal of self-respect were plunged into destitution. And they were limited in the opportunities that they could be presented with. And more often than not, they engaged in those acts and those occupations which were the most vilified and the most humiliating, such as working with dead cows in a society which actually had elevated the cow to a very maternal role and had a great religious significance. There were 13, I found the record, there were 13 million Hindus
Mm.
scattered around the country who were confined in concentration camps, designated as inheritors of criminal attributes, even at the time of partition. This
This is
is the origin of the untouchable class.
this is so shocking. I mean, we've heard untouchables, but we don't know the history of where this originated from, and the severity and the scale, the enormous scale of what transpired. I'm surprised that this is not so readily understood and uh, shared with the population at large.
Well,
That
this is why I mentioned Middleton's work right at the beginning,
right.
because he accepts responsibility, that the civilization which he represents was responsible for this. He was aware of what had been done and what the impact of it was, but it was politically um, toxic for anybody to know about this. It took quite a bit of digging around to find the records that this was what was done, and it was done with malice.
I have another question for you. We particularly in our times when when our kids were growing up, uh, and as you stated in earlier on in your presentation, in your talk, when you said when you're growing up in the United Kingdom, there was no concept of, you do not use that lens at all, the caste lens at all. You do not see that in society until somebody moved a piece of legislation in the House of Parliament. And I would say the same truth holds in the US as well, where I live, which is that when we meet people, we don't really think of what caste that individual belongs to. That thought never crosses our mind. So when we were raising our kids, we did not really teach them that there are all these different castes, as has been instituted, I should say. But in modern times, the way things stand today, with the kind of conflicts that we have in society, particularly in India, but also being used in parts, in other parts of the world, like the U.S. And I know if you can also tell me what you've been doing, or the work you've been doing in the U.S. on that front. But my question really is around how parents can explain these ideas and these caste-related questions in a manner that doesn't dissolve the benefits or the ideas in the original Hindu scriptures, but also presents, it doesn't burden them essentially with this inherited guilt uh,
Mm.
or with defensiveness.
And it's a question which is at the heart of the issue, isn't it? I referred to this consciousness, this idea, as a mimetic virus. Right. And that analogy actually fits very well. And the way in which you immunize yourself against the harmful impact of being infected by a virus is to have exposure to a limited amount of it in advance. And then your intellectual immune system can deflect it because it knows the methodology and the pathology of this particular mimetic virus. We have to have these conversations. I did some work which you mentioned. I was part of a conference called Dissolving Caste Consciousness, which we held in the Bay Area in San Francisco, because in exactly the same way as Lord Harry's had tried to seed it into the consciousness of the British people in 2013, exactly the same strategy was deployed against the Hindu community of the Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area. the same process and an intention to save the Hindus from killing themselves and harming each other through this terrible, terrible Hindu caste system. That trope had been proliferated through the legislative bodies in California. And so we had to deal with this issue. And a part of the process of dealing with this issue was to have a conference called Dissolving Caste Consciousness. And we presented this to the audience there. It was very well supported and attended sessions that we had. And at the end of it, a large number of our youngsters had become familiar with the idea that caste is actually, one, it's unnatural. The assertion that there is a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous structure which God conceived of and fed into this incredibly beautiful construct we call the world and existence, it's nonsense. Only a pathologically insane God would create something of that sort. And so it's unnatural. And because it's unnatural for us to accept it as a reality, which is why dharmic diaspora communities all over the world share one profile, and that is that we evolve without being discriminators against other human beings. You know, we are the tradition which naturally said, Atithi Devo Bhava. All right. And that doesn't say check out the caste of the Atithi first because it might not be a Deva. It's a complete and it's the opposite of everything that we have enshrined in our wisdom and in our sanskaras. But we do have to teach vulnerable children who are open to receiving negative samskaras by parties who benefit from separating those children from their ancestry and their community. We have to do some active work here. I recall a very specific incident where a father whose daughter had come back home from university and declared quite openly, I'm not a Hindu because Hindus have caste as a caste system and I can't be associated with it. And I recall how traumatized he was when he was telling me. He said that, we've never even spoken about this rubbish. We don't practice this. Why on earth would we want to be telling these children this? And an African American activist, a human rights activist, she actually mentioned to me in one of the conversations, she said, "You're not talking to your children, but other people are. You do need to talk to them because others are." And there is a lesson in that. And that's also part of why I've written the book and have devoted so much time to this issue. I have every intention of trying to restore a natural state of harmony between the children of our family, first and foremost, and then being able to share this with children of non-Hindu families so that they too can purge caste consciousness from their own understanding of who we are.
Thank you, Mr. Panditji. I've got one final question, and
Gee,
then we'll close. It is to India's credit that with all the onslaughts over the last 1500, 1800 years, 2000 years or so, um, that it has survived as a civilization when every other civilization has perished, vanished, or died. You know, you can you can talk about the South American, Central American civilizations. You can talk about the Egyptians, the Greeks, and on and on and on. And while that has happened for India, that India has survived, uh, will this endure in this world, in modern times, in today's times? Will this endure? And how does Bharat survive and thrive from this point on? Because I think that I would say the if the battles are still being fought. The battles are still being fought to control, a certain to control civilizations, to control direction of history for a certain set of people. How does Bharat itself survive and thrive from this point on? What are the things that it will have to do, she will have to do, and the
it's a
people will have
great,
to do?
it's a great concluding question. One thought springs to my mind, and that is that Hanumanji did not know who he was until he was reminded of his true nature. And I think a part of our journey is for our Sanatani family to be reminded of their true nature. and then we become infinitely capable and harmonious. Now, our true nature is, if I can put it in this manner, when the Euro-Christian Empire encountered Galileo and Copernicus and people of that sort, it had a conflict. The conflict was they'd been teaching for a long period of time that one, the Earth is flat, and two, the world, the universe revolves around the Earth. And yet these two gentlemen were saying, no, no, no. On the basis of scrutiny, on the basis of vision, on the basis of research, they were rishis, right? Galileo and Copernicus adhered to the rishi tradition. They were in pursuit of satya. And so when they articulated Satya, it had the capacity to bring down these institutions which were established on asatya and were mechanisms for basically incomplete, unevolved human beings to acquire a huge amount of power. When the Euro-Christian Empire encountered these gentlemen, it shook, and they came to a truce, which basically said, please don't turn your search for Satya on us. Let us do what we want to do, and you guys carry on. Let's have an uncomfortable truth. Can you imagine what happened to the movements, the empires, when they encountered a nation of Galileos? Can you imagine the shock and the horror that went through them? That, oh my God, and this is recorded in Germany, German scholars, when they studied Sanskrit, they came to an understanding that a civilization that can produce a perfect vehicle for recording every human experience and sentiment and preserving it intact across generations with sound incorporated, so exactly the same word would have been articulated and expressed in exactly the same manner thousands of years ago. This is not a bunch of illiterate natives, and they pose a clear and present danger to everything we have told our populations, our subservient populations, for the best part of 2,000 years. And so they set about trying to seek every manner in which this could be dismantled. But they're fighting the nature of creation because we are searching for Satya. We have always searched for Satya, and we want to share that search with everybody else so that everybody can discover the reality of what they are and who they are, and indeed why they are here. So our purpose and the methodologies we use are entirely aligned with creation. The only thing that has been a bit of a hiccup is that people have used violence to try and diminish the way in which we view the world and take us from a pursuit of satya through experimentation, which we call sadhana. The sadhana is nothing other than running an experiment on the very fact of your own existence, right? And we have had violent um, episodes which have tried to say to us, that's not valid. You have to come into the fold of the blind believers. And this is unnatural. So when we have an alignment occurring with what is natural, the whole of nature supports us. Dharmo rakshiti rakshita actually means that if you act in accordance with the resonance and the principles of creation, then creation's resonance will support you in your journey as well. And so the more we connect with this uncompromising pursuit of what is real, relying on our own judgment, our own natural instincts of justice and seeking anand for everybody, the more and more we become empowered. And as we become re-empowered, our light starts to spread to other corners where there is still darkness. So I'm confident that if we continue with a bit more confidence and with the example of Hanumanji, remembering who we are and why we are here, with courage and with compassion, we can reverse the harm that has been done very, very quickly. In fact, in my own Sankalpa, I have this notion that by 2027, when we get to December, we will have brought down this false edifice of lies about who we are and the allegations made against us, and hopefully created a generation of Sanatanis who have dissolved caste consciousness.
Wonderful. On that very resounding, inspiring note, Panditji, I'm sad but also happy to conclude our talk today. Sad to because there was so much more we could have been discussing and talking about and hearing from you. But happy because I learned so much, and I'm sure our audience learned as well. Before we go, if you can share if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
That's wonderful. I'm very easily contactable. One of the wonderful things about this age and time and it's heaven sent, is that we have the capacity to communicate with millions across the globe. I was in a room, a Twitter space the other day, and I think it was Elon Musk, and there were 64 million people in this one space. Never before has humanity had the capacity to reach millions of people across the planet in the same time slot. So we have this available to us to reverse the harm that has been done to us. And on X, I have a handle, The British Hindu. My website is available and accessible. It's very unimaginatively satishksharma.com. And so people can contact me through there. And I hope that when we do actually put this out into the public space, then there'll be a link to get in touch. This, thank you for the opportunity for a shout out. This is work that can be done. The map to completing this and having a successful conclusion to this by 2027, the roadmap is already there. But in order for it to be done, we need a lot more people to step forward and to engage with us in whatever manner they can. And we can help them work through their risk profile and establish what they can do without having too much exposure or, shall we say, undue attention brought to them. And then we can work out how we can use their support. Please, I would shout out, do reach out to us. We want to get to the stage where we're taking this program to every university in Bharat, to every young group of Sanatanis, and also to many of the people who are infected with this caste consciousness, who are not members of our family, because they have a role to play and they're very keen to play it.
Thank you. With that, Panditji, appreciate you coming. Namaste to you. Namaste to everyone. And we look forward to our
Jai
next
Shri Rama.
Jai
Om.
Shri Ram. And just before we conclude, to remind our audience, our participants, our next discussion will be on the Aryan invasion theory. We are going all controversial this month. The Aryan invasion theory to be delivered by Amritanshu Pandey on the 26th of February, 7 a.m. Pacific, 8:30, I think it is 8:30 p.m. IST at that point, in February still. So we look forward to continuing this important civilizational inquiry with all of you. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much. Bye bye now.
Om.